There was once a 6 meters long, weighed 4 tons, and more than half its body was just an enormous belly. Yet its head was only the size of an American football. When it walked, it looked exactly like a giant, wobbly bowling pin. Yet it was this very creature, this ultimate bizarre loser, that looked as though it could starve to death at any moment, that dominated the entire North American continent during the Permian Period. But the most mind-boggling fact of all is that it has absolutely nothing to do with dinosaurs. Its name is Cotylorhynchus. It is the most ancient, direct, distant relative of all mammals, which means it is your ancestor. In 1937, scientists digging in the red sandstones of Oklahoma unearthed the complete skeleton of Cotylorhynchus. Staring at its incredibly exaggerated, barrel-like thoracic cavity and its wide pelvis, the experts briefly thought they had stumbled upon a graveyard for pregnant prehistoric beasts. It wasn't until later, after unearthing dozens of identical fossils, that the academic world despairingly admitted it wasn't pregnant at all. It just naturally looked like that. But it doesn't end there. What truly leaves one breathless are its absurd proportions, as if the creator modeled it while completely drunk. This 6-meter-long, 4-ton terrestrial aircraft carrier had a body the size of a stretch limousine, but dangling from its neck was a 30-centimeter head, barely the size of an American football. It's the equivalent of driving a heavy-duty limousine, but the steering wheel in your hands is a tiny children's toy. This severely imbalanced anatomy caused experts worldwide to collectively crash. With a brain the size of a walnut and a mouth that could barely open, how did it command this 4-ton mountain of flesh to survive? You must understand, 270 million years ago, grass didn't even exist on Earth. For a behemoth of this size to survive was practically defying the heavens. Every single day, it had to chew on low-nutrition ferns for over a dozen hours just to maintain its ridiculous physique. Yet this very creature, this apparent loser that looked perpetually on the brink of starvation, actually thrived on that desolate continent, surviving for tens of millions of years, becoming the Permian Period's most ubiquitous large herbivore. But that's still not the most outrageous part. The truly wild operations were yet to come. At the very front of its skull sat a pair of impossibly massive external nostrils, taking up almost 2/3 of its entire face. These weren't just for show. But before we reveal the true purpose of this nose, you first must understand its biologically repulsive, almost grotesque digestive system. Because between these two features lies one of the most insane closed-loop evolutionary mechanisms in Earth's history. The Permian Period was covered in rough, hard, practically nutrient-void fern plants. Chewing on this stuff was no different from chewing on dry, stiff cardboard. With a head the size of a football and a mouth full of sesame seed-sized teeth, Cotylorhynchus somehow had to frantically swallow 120 kilograms of plant matter every single day, equivalent to swallowing the weight of 2 grown men daily. To squeeze every last drop of nutrition out of this cardboard, Cotylorhynchus did something absolutely maniacal. It literally evolved its own body into a living, supersized biochemical fermentation tank. If you sweep past its massive rib fossils, you will find that its intestines took up over 70% of its total body volume. Inside an ultra-long digestive tract, measuring over 20 meters, hundreds of millions of microbes worked frantically, 24 hours a day. A single mouthful of food had to ferment in its stomach for an entire week. Its belly was as massive as a mountain of flesh, not because it ate so much, but because its digestion was agonizingly slow. And this is exactly where that giant nose came into play. Do you have any idea how much heat is generated? By fermenting 120 kilograms of plant matter in your stomach every day, it was equivalent to housing a blazing furnace inside its body. The Permian Period itself was already blisteringly hot. If it couldn't dissipate that heat rapidly, Cotylorhynchus would literally cook itself alive from the inside out. Therefore, that giant nasal cavity, taking up 2/3 of its face, was fundamentally functioning as a high-powered liquid cooling radiator, an exhaust fan. On one hand, it cooled the scorching inhaled air. On the other, it expelled the massive thermal energy produced by internal fermentation. Not to mention, this biological chemical plant produced enough methane every day to knock itself unconscious. To satiate this ever-heating, bottomless pit, its limbs were as thick as bridge pillars, and its broad feet were equipped with massive, hook-like claws. Every day, like a heavy-duty excavator, it frantically tore up the earth for over 10 hours, digging up underground roots and stems, all to find that tiny, life-sustaining trace of starch. This massive chubby beast maxed out at a top speed of only 5 kilometers per hour, slower than an elderly man out for a stroll. So, what happened when it encountered the apex predator of its time, Dimetrodon? A creature boasting a mouthful of fangs and a massive dorsal sail? Its defense strategy was highly insulting. It consisted of just 2 words: lay flat. When an apex killer charged over, Cotylorhynchus would simply flop onto the ground, pressing its massive belly firmly against the earth. Its skin was exceptionally rough and tough. Biting into it felt much like biting into an abandoned heavy-duty tire. You can only imagine the utter despair from Dimetrodon's perspective. Facing this mountain of flesh, it couldn't even flip it over, leaving it with no place to sink its teeth. And if, by some miracle, it actually bit open the stomach, it would be instantly blasted in the face by a high-temperature, foul-smelling eruption of methane and fermenting bacteria. Who would risk their life to hunt a 4-ton mobile septic tank ready to rupture at any moment? Thus, these prehistoric assassins could only swallow their saliva and detour around it, muttering curses. By relying on this bizarre strategy of maxing out its fermentation tank build, it successfully survived for tens of millions of years, becoming the most successful terrestrial overlord of the Permian. It brutally forged an evolutionary path by growing to several tons just by eating plants. But Mother Nature never plays favorites. At the end of the Permian Period, 250 million years ago, the true apocalypse descended. Siberia experienced a supervolcanic eruption that lasted for over 1 million years. Global temperatures skyrocketed by 10 degrees in an incredibly short time frame. The oceans boiled, and the continents turned into toxic gas chambers. Over 96% of marine life and 70% of terrestrial life were obliterated in an instant. The ferns, once abundant and inexhaustible, withered in mass. Cotylorhynchus paid the most tragic price for its past success. It had invested every single one of its evolutionary points into a massive digestive system specifically tailored for one type of plant. This resulted in a pathetically tiny brain and a movement speed as slow as a snail. When the environment drastically shifted, it couldn't change its diet, nor could it flee that desolate wasteland. In the end, this former massive herbivorous king of North America, dragging its enormous, permanently empty fermentation tank, succumbed to endless starvation and suffocation, falling forever upon the scorching red earth. Even hundreds of millions of years after their death, their fossils are still found tightly huddled together, as if they were seeking one last comfort during that doomsday. Today, when we stare at this bizarre, tiny-headed, huge-bellied skeleton in a museum, whatever you do not laugh at it. It was once the most perfect answer to survival on this planet, but it also used its entire species' demise to teach us a cold, hard truth. In the gamble of evolution, no one can ever rest easy. Those absolute advantages that make you a ruler in good times, those extreme specializations you proudly flaunt, are often the very things that become your deadliest gallows when the great reshuffle arrives. In the face of the ruthless rules of an Earth that respects no martial ethics, our ugly ancestor, Cotylorhynchus, could not escape.